Psalm 81 is, notice he says, sing aloud to God our strength. Make a joyful shout to God of Jacob. Raise a song and strike the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the lute. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon, on their solemn feast day. Now notice the new moon would be, if you have a 30-day calendar, so the first of the month would always be the new moon. So this was what they talk about the new moon, and of course a lot of times they would have special sacrifices on that day also. He says, for this is a statute for Israel, a law of God of Jacob, that he established in Joseph as a testimony when he went throughout the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I did not understand. I removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were freed from the baskets. He called in trouble, and I delivered him. I answer you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. O Israel, if you will listen to me, there shall be no strange foreign god among you, nor shall you worship any foreign god. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart, to walk in their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend at submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock. I would have satisfied you. And so we see now that this is another Psalm of Asaph, but this one is a call to worship. It's the first day of the month, and as you read this, most commentators believe this was the Day of Atonement, which would have been the first day, or actually the seventh month, which would be roughly our September, October. It would be Yom Kippur, or sometime usually in early October. But it would be the holiest of days. In fact, that's the one day that I've talked to you about my baseball hero growing up. The first time I ever heard of Yom Kippur was when Sandy Koufax wouldn't pitch in the World Series against the Minnesota Twins, I think. I was a 7th or 8th grader, and he was my hero at the time. But then I found that, but the holiest of days, you'll find out these talk show hosts and radio commentators and actors and actresses who are Jews. That's the one day they take off, because that is the holiest of the days. That's the one day that the priest when the temple would go in to the Holy of Holies and present the sacrifice to the Lord. But it was a series of festivals around it. It was a time, the Feast of Trumpets would be the first day of that 7th month. And then on the 10th day, you would have the Day of Atonement. And then on the 15th day of that 7th month, you had the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Tents. And of course, the Feast of Trumpets was the calling. They had a system through Israel, especially early as Israel, where that ram's horn, it could be heard for miles. But they would blow it, and they would relay the message throughout the land with a certain tone of that ram's horn. Then they would know whether it's a call to battle or what. And so that's one way that they had a ready defense force very quickly. They could summon up the army by those, let the trumpets be blown throughout the land. Or it could be that, the king had died or something like that. But they had their own signal. And so that was called the Feast of Trumpets. And then on the 10th day, of course, that's when the Lord called Israel out of Egypt. And then on the 10th day, you had the Day of Atonement, which was set up in Sinai in the book of Leviticus. And also you had the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Tents. This was a time when the children of Israel, and even today, and some with many Jews, they will have a time where there's a tent set up and they will remind themselves of their heritage. And so we see that this was a call to worship then. And the first 5 verses, we see that he says, "Sing aloud to God our strength, make a joyful shout to the Lord, and then tune up your instruments." Notice he says, raise a song and strike the timbrel and pleasant harp and the lute, blow the trumpet. The timbrel was the, they bring it today. What is it called? The cymbal, what's that? Tambourine. Okay, tambourine. The pastor's moment there. But tambourine, and a lot of times the ladies would be the ones who played the tambourines. If you remember Miriam and other people that played or they would use that, and the lute and so forth was roughly the guitar, and blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon and the full moon. And so for this is a statute. That notice this was a time, this was something designated that Israel was to do. So I'm calling everybody to worship. This is our worship service. So you can imagine the feast of this would be where he'd blow that, and everybody in Israel from Dan to Beersheba earlier would be listening for the sound of that trumpet. And so so there was a call to worship. A law of, notice he established Joseph. This is, in other words, I set my covenant up with them. And of course, and not mentioning all of Israel, notice a law of Jacob, but then he talks about Joseph. So many people believe that he's kind of lamenting at the fact, if you remember Asaph's, one of the Asaphs, the one in the middle that we know of, lamented the fact that northern Israel had been under the siege of the Assyrians. And so notice he talks about Joseph, which would be the northern 10 tribes, or actually would be Ephraim and Manasseh, as opposed to Judah being the representative of the southern tribes. But he said, when I went throughout the land of Egypt, and I heard a language I did not know. So he's saying, of course, it goes back, and notice how they go back, the Day of Atonement. They go back to Egypt. They go back to the Exodus. How many times have we said? Hundreds of times we see through the Bible that they keep referring back to, I brought you out of Egypt, or he brought us out of Egypt. And so that was the time. I mean, that was the greatest miracle in all the Old Testament, was the Red Sea crossing. And so he brought them out of Egypt. And then we see that last verse, or that last phrase of the 5th verse, where he says, where I heard a language I did not understand. So, and again, in studying that, we think that he means that I didn't understand it till God revealed it to me. And so, in other words, I got a message from the Lord. And this is what the Lord told me. And so we see now the rest of the passage is a passage of God's message to his people. And first of all, we see in verses 6 through 8, we see God's past care. I removed his shoulder from the burden. Of course, he liberated them from their slavery, and he freed his hands from the baskets, again, the idea of slavery, and he called in trouble, and you called in trouble, and I delivered you. Notice the first, the pronouns here. And so he says, this is what God has done. I answered you in the secret place of thunder, and I tested you at the waters of Meribah. And of course, you remember where the water was turned to sweet, and all the testings that the Lord did with his people. And of course, later on in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verses 1 through 15, the Lord said, why did I do this? I mean, I'll let you go through and I let you suffer hunger. I'll let you go through the trials to test you, to see what was in your heart, to see whether you would serve me or not. Yes, I gave you manna, which you what you didn't know. Your shoes never wore out. Your feet didn't swell. You had everything you needed, and yet I still tested you. And that's a great passage there in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And so we see that God said that my past care, I loved you. And even at Meribah, where the water was bitter but turned sweet, I just showed you time and time again that I could overcome heartaches and trials and bitterness. And so why does God allow us to have troubles? Why do I have troubles today? I mean, my car tore up yesterday or whatever. So there again, can I trust God in these situations? Life is, as Ecclesiastes says, man is born for trouble as the sparks fly upward. That's just life until we see the Lord again. And so we cast all of our cares upon him. So really these trials that we have in life are just workshops. They're things where God wants to show us his great grace. He wants to show us that he'll never leave us or forsake us. He shows us how they could turn bitterness into sweet. He shows how they could heal relationships, all these different things that God allows in our lives to show us his strong notes. He says, sing aloud to the God of our strength, to God our strength. And so he is our strength. And so we see that he's appealing to Israel now. In verses 8 through 10, we see he makes this statement twice, one here and one later on. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. O Israel, if you would listen to me. O Israel, if you would listen to me. And that's what God wants us to do. Come unto me, all you that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Call me, and I will answer you in the time of trouble. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Time after time, God says, ask, and it shall be given unto you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. ASK. God wants to do these things for us. But he says, you have not because you ask not. I want you to ask. I want to give you things. I want to be a blessing to you. And this is a theme of the whole rest of the book, is I wanted to be a blessing to Israel. And I still want to be a blessing to Israel. And so he says, oh, if you would just listen to me, oh, if you'll just allow me to work in your favor. But the one thing that I have commanded you, in verse 9, is I've commanded you that you shall have no foreign gods. And of course, that was the first of the commandments. No gods before me. No foreign god among you, nor shall you worship any foreign god. Don't worship those. Don't put them in front of me. That's the one requirement I ask you, is to put me first. And of course, put me only. And so we see that he says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open wide your mouth, and I will fill it. That reminds me of, we had little starlings that had gotten up into our eaves of the church, and our kids were small, and so the starlings are just kind of a worthless bird, and they are more a nuisance than anything. But the starling, the thing about it is we knocked the nest down because it was really causing a problem where it was in the gutter, and but the sad thing about it, it sure was hard to, and I didn't, and in fact, the kids tried to keep, but those big mouths of those small little birds, they were just opening up wide, and they're wanting food. And how can you tell your little daughter, and Timothy, who's 6, 7 now, but still with a tender heart, okay, we're going to just let them go. What, Daddy? So we tried to keep them alive, but without their mother, they didn't survive. But that was, there again, open wide, and I would fill it like a little bird. Just, Lord, open wide. And God said, I'll fill it. If you'll just let me. If you'll turn to me. What do you have to do if you open your mouth wide as a starling? You have to look up. You have to look up to the Lord. And someone said about a bumblebee. A bumblebee is, if you put it in a cylinder glass, that bumblebee can go, and it hovers back and forth, and all the scientific thing about how fast those wings gyrate. But the one bad thing about the bumblebee is it will beat itself to death because it can't look up. And so it won't go out. It'll just keep going back and forth over and over and can't figure out why it can't get out. And so it's kind of interesting. But a starling, it can look up. And it's open wide and I will feel it. Do you remember that, Jason, where we, those starlings that were alongside the roof and we knocked it off and the big old mouth for a little old bird? Was that just when Timothy and Danielle were small? But because we were going to get rid of the starlings, but we couldn't and we couldn't feed them to the cats or anything else because, there again, I couldn't do it myself, let alone with the kids begging you not to. But there again, I never will forget those big, huge mouths, though, for the little old bird. And that's what God is saying. Open wide and I'll fill it. I'll be that mother bird. I will be that God that will meet your needs. I'll bring the worm. I'll bring whatever it is you need. Notice how that God is, his tender, loving care for his people. And so we see that he says, oh, Lord, just listen to me. Don't put any other gods in front of me. Then verses 11 and 12, we see his remorse. Because he says, but my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart to walk in their own counsel. And this is and how many times we see in the book of Romans, 3 different times. I gave them up. I gave them over to reprobate minds to do what they would do. And so here we see that God, whenever God gets, the worst thing that God can do is say, okay, I'm going to let you go. That you don't want that. Why is God convicting me? Why is God, all the, and you feel frustrated with God. I tell people that you don't want God to let you go. Maybe he's trying to tell you something. Maybe he's telling you to do something or not to do something. Maybe he's telling you to get into his word and seek, ask and it shall be given, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened. So maybe it's just a good old hunger he's giving you until you find him. They that seek me shall find me. And so whatever it is, but Israel would not even have anything to do with me. They would have none of me. How sad. And so he said, this was the history of Israel. And you look back in the book of Judges, and you see that time after time, God would raise them up, and then they would go back into their apostasy. God would bring an enemy along to enslave them. Then he would bring a judge to raise them up, and then they would go right back through the cycles, time after time, because they, all they wanted was the blessings of God. They didn't want to really serve God. And so we see that he says, but they would have none of me, so I gave them over to their own stubborn heart. How sad when you see this among Christians. I know I tried that, but I'm just not going to serve God, or I'm not coming to church anymore, or you people down there just much full. Well, it's always interesting how they change pronouns. It goes from us and we to you people, and the people of the church or whatever, And so, so I gave them up to their own stubborn heart, and they followed their own counsel. There's a way that seems right unto man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. And so the worst thing that God can do is say, go. And sometimes a parent will do that. So now you have to be very careful with that because you don't want to be neglectful. But okay, if you're going to get on those roller skates without knee pads on, then you're going to pay a price. And you see the kid out there and he falls and screams and hollers and bloody murder. Well, maybe he could learn. I think the one that I still remember is we had gone fishing in my early ministry back before Hurricane Frederick wiped out the bridge that went over to Dauphin Island. They put a new bridge up since then. But there were some old catfish heads off to the side. And the saltwater catfish, those fins, if they touch you or if they prick you, they sting, they just burn the fire out of you. And so if you could catch a saltwater catfish, you better know how, you better have some gloves on, and you better have pliers and everything else, because you don't want to touch those things. But we had a little boy with us. I think he's about 7 or 8 years old, but he was a little bratty kid. And his mother kept telling him, now you better put your shoes on and don't go over there where those catfish heads are. And he just would keep roaming around, and he was irritating all of us men. We were about 12, 13 of us out there fishing. Most of us were men, but there were a couple of ladies that came with their husbands. And she brought her boy, which was fine, as long as, we were ready to teach him if he would just shut up and listen, whatever. But he wouldn't. And so he was out there just playing around. And we kept telling him, and his mother kept telling him, not to get over there barefooted among those fish, or among those fish heads. About 3 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden, it was screaming bloody murder, and that was the time when the bay was just a sheet of little glass. It just looked beautiful across the bay, and that you could hear that kid, I'm sure, all the way across on the other side of the bay. I mean, even to Dolphin Island, which would have been a mile away. Just screaming. And sometimes, now his mother didn't let him go, but he just kept going. And sometimes, a parent will just say, okay, you got to learn on their own. Now, you have to be careful with that again, because I'm not telling parents to neglect, and I'm sure that, and mothers are not going to neglect. I know that most of you won't, or all of you wouldn't. So there again, how do you teach your kids not to play with matches, or whatever else? And so we see that the Lord says, I let them go in their own counsels. And that's a dangerous thing for you and for me. Not for God, but for you and me. And then notice he says in verse 13 again, he says, now that was his remorse, but his desire. Notice in verse 13, oh, that my people would listen to me. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. So I'll take care of if they would just listen to me, I'll protect them. I'll take care of them. Instead of raising up enemies against them, like I did with in the book of Judges, or as later on we see with the Babylonians and the Assyrians and others, God says, I'm going to raise up these people and I'm going to punish Israel because of this, rather than defending Israel from them. And so how many times does God allow someone to get upset with us because he's wanting to prove us, or that he is really working, when that person wouldn't even give us time of day, except for some reason we irritated him. Sometimes, Lord, is this recalcitrant neighbor of mine, is this a testing of you, or is this really punishment? But whatever it is, Lord, I want to make sure that I'm in your will. And so if you're going to humble me through this person, then show me the way. And if I'm doing anything wrong, especially if I'm, making noise at 2 o'clock in the morning or something that I need to make sure that I'm not doing to irritate him, then Lord, help me. But so the Lord will many times allow these testings to come along our way. But we see that he said, that if God will listen to me, I will subdue their enemies. I like the Monroe Doctrine. It's amazing how that the revivals were sweeping through this country for about the better part of 80 years. There were some revivals going on in this country, different that God was dealing with. But between 1800 and 1840, those were the times of the camp meeting revivals and all the things that really, as America was moving westward, the preachers were going along with them, and those wagon trains, they would saw off an old tree, and the guy would stand on the stump and preach. That's one reason you have Methodists and Baptists go all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that's why you only have enclaves of others like Presbyterians and others, because they weren't as evangelical. But you'll have a Methodist or a Baptist church in just about every town from the east to now there was. Now those are all closing down, about 40 a day, I understand, in America today. But the westward expansion also took the gospel from coast to coast. And of course, now I'm not saying anything about Presbyterians and others. I'm saying, I'm just saying that's the way it worked. Now, with that, about what was it, Monroe, about 1820, somewhere around there, Monroe, James Monroe. They were having a lot of problems with people still wanting to colonize America. And so James Monroe made one of the most startling speeches and made it a doctrine where he told the European nations, at that time they were the only ones who were trying to get in, that there will be no more colonization of North or South America. Now, we only had 6 ships, the Constitution, Constellation, and they were small. They were not the big, huge man of war. At the time that the British had 600 ships, but the British also were very wary of the French and the Germans. And so one of the ways that God has protected us from all the battles that went on in Europe coming over to was that Monroe Doctrine. But what God did with that was the English said, we're just about broke from all these Napoleonic wars. We can't really colonize if we want to, but if we can't, nobody else is either. So the British Navy was kept, the Germans and the Dutch and the Russians and everybody else that wanted to colonize. That's one reason we have coast to coast. Because anybody would have wanted to take over. If there wasn't the Spanish, it would have been the Germans or the whatever that would have tried to take over the East Coast and the West and parts of Canada. In fact, we still had some problems with Britain later on there, but that was a friendly nation that we could work things out with. And so, but it was interesting how that God protected this land. And yet, did we have problems? Yes. But it's amazing how that God, we escaped 2 major wars where millions of people were killed in the 20th century. All because, nobody could attack us. And it really boiled back down to that Monroe Doctrine. And so it's kind of interesting how that God protected us even though we didn't know that at the time. Now look what's happening. We're seeing the Chinese and everybody else moving in. And we're going to start seeing, as the Lord says, he started cutting off the edges of Israel whenever they were sinning. And now we're going to start seeing, one of the first things we see now is terrorist groups, and we're going to see raiding parties and all kinds of other things in our country, and unfortunately, I think pretty soon, especially with the open borders crowd and all the rest. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I'm not a prophet, so that's just my opinion, but it sure looks like the Lord is robbing us of our security, or not robbing us, he's taking our security from us. But this is what God said, I would have protected you better. You would have never had problems with the Amalekites and the Amorites and the Philistines especially and the Syrians. They would have never gotten close to you if you would have just obeyed me. But you didn't. And I want to judge those who were pretended even to follow me. Now, notice the last verse. He said, and this is the idea of what could have been. He said, so I gave them over to he says in verse 16, he would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you. Honey from the rock. Now, of course, we know they got water from the rock, but he's saying I would have really sweetened it up. And we know that the land that they were in was the land of milk and honey. And how many times do we see honey mentioned in the history of Israel? Remember Jonathan, as he had defeated the enemy, and they found honey, and he ate it, of course, when his father said they couldn't eat honey. Remember Samson, and the honey that he ate from the lion. Now that was, he should not have eaten it, but the honey was bountiful. He shouldn't have eaten it from the lion. He should have eaten it from the rock. And even today, I was reading in 1850s when, who was it, Spurgeon or somebody had visited the Middle East, and they said one of the things that really astounded them was the amount of honey in that area. And so honey from the rock and the crevices of the rock and so forth. Now, I don't know today. Of course, we know that they have a lot of citrus and so forth, which would be very conducive for sweet honey and so forth. So we see that it was the land of milk and honey. I would have fed you, even from a rock, if you'd have just listened to me. And so he said, and so he would have given his finest to them. Notice he says in Deuteronomy 32. Now, Deuteronomy is Moses' swan song to the people, and he preaches 4 basic messages to them, and all of them are just follow God. He goes back and he goes through the history, and of course he's talking to a new generation that had come out. They had not, unless they were less than 20 years old, whenever at the Red Sea crossing, they would be 60 at the most. At the time, the oldest person would be 60, except for Caleb and Joshua, and then of course Moses would pass on. So he's preaching to people that are now half his age, and he's telling them, "Oh, just follow the Lord. Your parents didn't, but you can follow the Lord." And he just kept saying, "Choose life. I'm putting before you blessing and cursing. Choose life, life and death." And so he's saying, and so we see that he says to them. In Deuteronomy 32:10, he says, he kept him, Israel, as the apple of his eye. Now he's talking to a new group of people there. In Psalm, I wrote down several other passages here about God's desire. Deuteronomy 32:13, he made him rule in the heights of the earth, that he might eat the produce of the fields, that fine wheat. He made him to draw honey from the rock and oil from the flinty rock. Of course, Psalm 84:11 says, no good thing will God withhold from them who walk uprightly. In Psalm 32:9, or Deuteronomy 32:19, oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. Oh, if they would have if your parents would have just listened and would have considered what they could have had if they would have just listened to me. So you listen to me. Then Isaiah, later on, talking to that recount, Israel was just a stiff-necked people, and he's talking to another generation, many generations later. Oh, that you had heeded my commandments. Then your peace would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. That's where we got the song we sang tonight, Like a River Glorious, peace like a river. Now, of course, a river gives you the idea of peace, but it's also got powerful currents. So peace has power. You think about it. But here we see that Isaiah said, I would have given you peace like a river. And then when the Lord, and this fascinating passage in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37. Now the first part, those first 36 verses, the Lord calls the people of Jerusalem scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, you whited walls, you whitewashed walls, you snakes, you vipers. He calls them all kinds of things. But then he goes up on the mountain and he weeps over them. That's why I say, if you're going to skin the sheep as a pastor, you better do it with a tear in your eye. If the preaching is to rebuke the people, then the preaching has to be done with a compassion that cares for the people. Not because you just a bunch of dirty old, you don't pay me enough, and all, whatever else. No, it's got to be with a tear in his eye. I genuinely care for you, because if you don't turn from your ways, God's going to judge us all. And so notice what the Lord does here. He goes up on the mountain after that scathing message that he gave to the scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites and all the rest. He goes up on the mountain and he looks over it and he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Oh, I wanted to meet your needs. I wanted you to turn to me, but you would not, as the King James says. And so, as a chick gathers her chicks under the wings, I understand, and I read a couple of stories about those old Kansas farmers, and they would have those prairie fires that would sweep through there. And that was one of the books that the kids read or when they were small or whatever. But the chicken yard of one of the farmers was kind of wiped out. The hen house and everything went. But he would go around and he would find the hens. And he would kick the carcass of that burned out hen, and underneath would be, under her wings, which were fireproof, or at least even she died, the feathers kept the chicks alive. And so here you have the Lord saying, I would have died for you. And of course he did die for us. And I would have gathered you like the hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. What a descriptive picture the Lord gives. Not only is he the shepherd, but he's also, he's the mother. He's everything that we need. And so that haunting verse of John Greenleaf Whittier that I put on there, of all the sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest of these is, it might have been, or what might have been. And I look back on my life and I go, if I'd have just served the Lord a little better, or if I had not done this, not that God beat me to death, but the blessings that I could have had. Now, I praise God for the blessings he's given me. But, if I'd have just put him first, said, boy, I want the very best from God. And so I'm going to do whatever it takes to get his very best, rather than settling for second best or sometimes the leftovers, because he loved me, but he wasn't going to give me his best unless I gave my best to him. And boy, can we all look back, by and by when I wish I would have served him more. I think that Fanny Crosby. So we're going to all have those regrets. But at the same time, this is a psalm of challenge. Let's don't have regrets. Let's be able to say with Paul, I finished the fight, I finished my course, and therefore is laid up for me, what God asked for me in heaven. And so, let's ask God for his very best. Okay. Is there any questions or comments about what we looked at today? A call to worship. Let's worship God. Oh, that my people would listen to me. So prayer is asking God to listen to us, but let's make sure that we're listening to him.